Hey everyone! Today I'm sharing the full story of my Camponotus fragilis colony, also known as the fragile carpenter ant, which has grown into one of the most fascinating colonies I've ever cared for. It's about 5 years old now, with over 1,500 workers, and while I wasn't the one who originally caught the queen, I've been there for everything since. Raising this colony has taught me a ton about ant behavior, colony dynamics, and honestly, about patience. And in this video, I want to walk you through what that whole journey has looked like. The early days, the growth, the weird quirks, and the challenges of keeping such a large colony happy and thriving. So let's start from the beginning. I received the queen from someone else. She was already settled in and had just laid a small clutch of eggs. There wasn't much to do except set her up in a secure, quiet space and let her do her thing. I placed her inside a tar heel ant's nucleus nest, kept it in a closet, and basically left her alone. For weeks, not much happened. I'd peek in occasionally, just to check humidity or see if anything had changed, but mostly it was a waiting game. Eventually, the first nanitics arrived, those tiny, pale first-generation workers that are always a little smaller and more fragile than the ones that come later. With fragile carpenter ants, these nanitics are absolutely essential, but they're not super efficient. They tend to get assigned to the lighter duties: brood care, basic maintenance, and general nest upkeep. Still, seeing them for the first time was a huge moment. It was the first real sign that the colony had a future. At this point, I started getting into a rhythm. I'd offer tiny drops of honey water using a bit of foil or a soaked cotton swab, and within a few minutes, the nanitics would be drinking. One thing I noticed early on, and this stuck through the years, is how much these ants rely on carbs. When they don't have access to sugar for even a short time, they start to act a bit more agitated. And while they're not known for being aggressive to humans, they can be surprisingly painful when they're underfed. It was a quick lesson in making sure they always had energy available. The feeding became a near daily ritual. I'd usually mix up honey water, sometimes dyed with food coloring so I could tell how much they were consuming, and check hydration levels inside the nest. The tar heel nest did a great job maintaining humidity, but I still kept an eye on things just in case. I also added a heat cable early on and kept it running constantly, since Camponotus fragilis doesn't require diapause like most carpenter ants. That means no winter shutdown. They stay active all year, and in turn, that means I have to be active in caring for them all year too. These early days were calm, but also a little deceptive. It feels manageable when you're only dealing with a handful of tiny workers, but even then, you can tell something bigger is coming. Every time I looked into the nest, there were a few more pupae, then more eggs, then more movement. It builds gradually but steadily, and before you realize it, that small group starts to multiply. Back then, I had no idea how big this colony would get. I was just fascinated by the little changes, the way the nanitics clustered together, how they cared for the brood, how the queen would shift positions subtly depending on temperature. I didn't really have a goal, I just wanted to see where things would go. And slowly but surely, the colony kept growing. There wasn't much drama in those early months, just quiet, slow progress, a kind of stillness that only ant keepers really understand. But behind that stillness, something incredible was taking shape. The foundation for a future colony was being laid, and all I had to do was stay consistent, stay patient, and let nature work. As the months passed, things started accelerating. The first nanitics were still around, but new workers began emerging, and right away, it was obvious they were different. These new ants were bigger, stronger, and far more active. That's when the whole feel of the colony started to shift. What used to be a slow, quiet group of delicate workers became a rapidly expanding operation. You'd check one day and everything would seem normal. Then you'd look again a few days later and the worker count had noticeably jumped. It wasn't an explosion, more like a steady, silent pressure building up. Before I knew it, the colony had passed 100 workers. That was a real turning point. Once fragile carpenter ants get to that size, everything becomes more intense. Their demand for food spiked. I'd leave them a generous amount of honey water, thinking it would last a day or two, and they'd drain it in a few hours. It's impressive, but it also meant I had to stay on top of it constantly. If If I missed even one feeding window, they'd start acting agitated, and that's when they got a little more interactive. And by interactive, I mean they started climbing into the feeding ports, wandering across the table, and a few times, even trying to find their way out through whatever cracks they could. Handling the colony at this stage was a bit chaotic, honestly. They were fast, way faster than I expected. Anytime I opened the outworld to clean or feed, I had to be ready. There were a few escape attempts, and let me tell you, chasing carpenter ants around your living room with a flashlight at night isn't something you plan for. But that's the trade-off with a healthy, thriving colony. They want to explore, to forage, to expand. They're not just surviving anymore. They're building. Feeding got more involved too. Honey water wasn't enough by this point. I introduced more protein, mealworms, bits of roach, boiled egg. They'd descend on these food items in waves, breaking them apart with coordinated efficiency and carrying the pieces back into the nest. What really struck me was how structured they were becoming. There were clear foragers, clear caretakers, even what seemed like sentries near the entrances. They weren't just a bunch of ants doing random things anymore. They were a colony, fully functional, with rhythm and roles. Their behavior also started to get a little odd in a good way. One of the quirks I began to notice was how they would move food around with no clear reason. A piece of protein would be dragged into one corner of the outworld, then moved an hour later, then stashed in a totally different place the next day. Sometimes they'd bring it halfway into the nest and leave it. Other times they'd bury it under substrate or wedge it into cracks. I still don't know exactly why they do this. Maybe it's related to temperature, maybe it's a kind of food caching instinct. But it's one of those little things that keeps the hobby fascinating. You're always discovering new patterns, even in a colony you've watched for years. As the colony grew, so did the demands on their environment. I had to make changes. The original nest, while great for founding, just wasn't enough space anymore. That's when I upgraded them to a larger nucleus nest from tar heel ants, which gave them more room and much better visibility into the chambers. I kept the heat cable running 24/7. One of the great things about Camponotus fragilis is that they don't require a winter diapause like most other Camponotus species. They just keep going. That heat, even a small difference, helped keep brood development steady, and the queen stayed consistently active. Daily care became a habit, checking hydration, topping off honey water, monitoring for trash buildup. You get into a rhythm, and even though it took more time and attention than it used to, it felt more rewarding. Every day, you could see the impact. More brood, more workers, more activity. It was like watching a tiny city slowly coming to life and knowing you were the one keeping it running. There were moments where it felt like too much, like I'd created something that was just barely under control. But then I'd sit down and just watch them work. The way they communicated, the coordination, the quiet intelligence behind their movements, it always pulled me back in. These weren't just bugs in a box. This was a superorganism, and I was lucky enough to be part of its growth. These days, the colony has grown into something way beyond what I originally expected. There are well over 1,500 workers now, spread across the nucleus nest and the outworld in a steady flow of activity. The entire setup has become this living, moving system. There's always something happening. Whether it's brood being rotated between chambers, workers scrubbing down the walls with their mandibles, or a small team relocating a food item for the third time that day, it never stops. And yet, after all this time, it still feels like they're just getting started. One of the things I've come to appreciate the most is how much personality this colony has. That might sound strange if you've never kept ants, but when you watch them every day, you start noticing patterns that make them feel distinct. The way they handle food is one example. They don't just consume it and move on. They interact with it. Sometimes they carry droplets of honey water around and stash them near brood, or they'll move a piece of protein deep into the nest, then bring it back out hours later. There doesn't always seem to be a clear purpose, but it's purposeful to them. Maintenance has settled into a pretty smooth routine by now. I check in on them every day, hydration levels, temperature, trash zones, general movement. They've got constant access to heat via a cable that runs along the side of the nest, and I've kept that consistent year-round. Since they don't require a diapause, the queen stays active and productive even through the colder months. That means no seasonal slowdown, just constant growth in a cycle that doesn't really let up unless I intervene. I feed them almost daily, mostly with honey water, and sometimes I'll dye it different colors just for fun. It lets me track how recently they've eaten and where the nutrients are going. Of course, with a colony this size, you can't expect it to be entirely peaceful. Every so often, I'll find a few ants scouting beyond where they're supposed to be, somehow slipping past the barriers and making it into the open. I've had fragile carpenter ants scurrying across my desk, across the wall, once even across the ceiling. They're shockingly fast when they want to be, and sometimes it takes a bit of creativity to coax them back inside. But I've learned to work with it. These little escape artists are just doing what ants do, looking for the next place to build, the next opportunity. I can't really blame them. What's most surprising after 5 years is how much this colony still teaches me. You'd think after thousands of hours watching them, you'd know what to expect. But there's always something new. A new way they store brood, a shift in how they divide labor, changes in how they handle different prey items. It's like a slow-motion documentary that never ends. And that's really the heart of ant keeping. The slow growth, the constant discovery, the quiet relationship you build with something most people overlook entirely. If you're already part of the hobby, you probably know exactly what I mean. And if you're new to this or just curious, I highly recommend checking out some of the online communities. One of the best places to start is the Ant Nest Discord. It's a great spot to connect with other keepers, ask questions, share photos, or just hang out and nerd out about ants. Everyone there is incredibly helpful, and it's where I've picked up a lot of knowledge over the years. And if you've got questions about this colony or about Camponotus fragilis in general, feel free to drop them in the comments. I read every one, and I'm happy to answer or even make follow-up videos if people are interested. Whether you're just getting started or thinking about your first queen, or you've been keeping ants for years and just want to swap stories, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching and sticking around to hear about my journey with this incredible species. The fragile carpenter ants have definitely lived up to their name, delicate in the beginning, but resilient and endlessly fascinating once they get going. I'll keep sharing updates as they grow, and who knows, maybe in another 5 years, I'll be looking back on this video with a colony 10 times the size. Until then, happy ant keeping.